Thank you very much, Brock, for that overly generous introduction. Well, I am in the gray-haired, aging-out speaker slot tonight. It's a bit of a swan song because, sadly, I'm about to rotate off of the board of the Decorative Arts Trust after a multi-decade line of service. And it's an organization of which I could not be prouder and how it has grown from strength to strength and under a remarkable director in Matt Thurlow, who I've also known since he was a toddler. I never thought I had had a particularly extraordinary life. Really until I started putting this lecture together and started reminiscing about Charleston. So tonight I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent and tell a bit of my story as we sail into Charleston using Thomas Leach's great view of 1774. And then I'm going to try and mention a few things that make me proud that I was able to give back to a city that gave me far more than I could ever return to it. I arrived here New Year's Day on 1981. I had made two prior visits, one as a child when my family had spent a Christmas and New Year's in Florida, and the second with the family of my boarding school roommate from St. Andrew's School in Middletown, Delaware, whose father had served as the co-chairman of South Carolina's Tricentennial Committee, Thomas Oregon Lawton III. So I had a wonderful introduction to South Carolina, and following my graduate studies, this was where I wanted to be. It was an exciting time to be in Charleston. Giancarlo Menotti had just brought the Spoleto Festival here. Pat Conroy was at the height of his powers, and my next-door neighbor in my first apartment was the magical Hayward Washington House, whose curator is here with us tonight. I think Pat Conroy captures better than I ever could what Charleston means to many of us. Charleston has a landscape that encourages intimacy and partisanship. I have heard it said that an inoculation to the sights and smells of the Carolina Lowcountry is an almost irreversible antidote to the charms of other landscapes, other geographies. You can be moved profoundly by other vistas, by other oceans, by soaring mountain ranges, but you can never be seduced. You can even forsake the Lowcountry, renounce it for other climates, but you can never completely escape the sensuous semi-tropical pull of Charleston and her marshes. I worked for an extraordinary lady, Frances Ravenel Smythe Edmonds, one of the great founders of the preservation movement here, the guardian of America's first preservation ordinance from 1931, which established an initial 138-acre historic district. It established the Board of Architecture Review. That would go on to expand. She was an indomitable force. We could use her here today, to be honest. I was often too young to respect someone who was, well, quite a force. I remember in one meeting, a staff member said, "Mrs. Edmonds, what is our policy on sick leave?" And she said, "If you're sick, you leave." And I think it's very difficult for an audience like this or young professionals to realize how unprofessional the field was in those early days. But I arrived here as an intern making $8,500 a year, and after 18 years serving as curator and director of museums, left for Sotheby's, lured by a six-figure salary, making $42,000 a year. The field has changed, and not in some cases. And here's that youthful, wide-eyed curator who had to walk a very tight rope, because mythology, the magnolias and the moonlight, was still revered here, and those who wanted to question long-held beliefs were held in suspicion. Luckily, I had that introduction. I had a lot of classmates in South Carolina. I had black tie, I had white tie, I had passable manners, and they served me well. I learned to keep my mouth shut as I worked with a decorating committee that consisted of the first generation of preservationists, Mrs. Robert N.S. Whitelaw, whose husband had been head of the Gibbs Museum of Art, whose director, an esteemed colleague, is here tonight, Mrs. Henry P. Stotts, one of Charleston's greatest hostesses, who gave midweek black-tie dinner parties and greeted you covered in Harry Winston jewelry, and Mrs. John P. Frost, and some of you will visit the house she lived in on Trad Street. The Russell House then, one of the flagship museums, was a myth, really, a quite beautiful myth created by those with immense taste, but it did not reflect authenticity, and I learned to walk that fine line as decorating committee meetings consisted of comments like, "I think it's divine," or "I think it's dreadful," and that decided what went into the house. Years later, of course, joined by one of our great interns at Historic Charleston, Lewis Nelson, is with us tonight, and Robert Leith joined the staff, and we stayed up all night, many nights for months on end, writing the initial grant to the Getty Foundation that would lay the groundwork for a proper investigation of this extraordinary property. My first residence was in the thick of it, in Catfish Row on Church Street, for which I paid $225 a month for the most incredible third-floor apartment. And my second house was behind the great William Gibbs house, where friends invited me to be their tenant, and upon my departure from Charleston, gave a black tie soiree for 250 people with an orchestra. It was that evening that a dear friend of mine said, "How can you leave us? How can you leave this place? You become a part of it." And I said, "I think before I die, I should live in a place where embracing diversity does not mean knowing a singular Presbyterian." To which he replied, "Why?" And I said, "I'm afraid you've just answered your own question. It's a delicious place to be trapped in a Jane Austen novel, but it does not mean that if your great-great-grandmother showed her ankle at the St. Cecilia Ball in 1818 that you are of questionable lineage." Behind that house, I created a bit of English magic with a paintbrush and a friend called Thomas Jane, and that carriage house became somewhat famous, set in an acre of gardens by Latrell Briggs with a fantastic Baroque pond you see here, a swimming pool that got a good workout, particularly when the Colonial Williamsburg curators visited me for the first time, and hijinks and high balls led to a little bit of skinny dipping. The next night, we were at the Miles Bruton house with Peter and Patty Manigault, the first time they had entertained after the house had been restored. The great chandelier was lit for this group. People were losing their minds. It was insane. Jeroboam of Champagne at a fabulous dinner with a perfect moon, and in Peter's toast, where he recognized so many of the curators, and particularly Graham Hood, he ended it with, "I'm only regretful that I have no swimming pool to offer you." It had gotten around town. Peter's one-time mother-in-law, the great Gertrude Sanford Lejeune, reigned at Medway Plantation. I thought this would be a part of my life forever, but of course, it was the end of an era. She was the most extraordinary present. She gave up the life of a debutante to become a big game hunter and collected specimens for natural history museums. She was the first uniformed female to be captured by the Nazis. She escaped, and none of that surprises me. And here we see her in late teens, painted by Sir William Orpin, and you already see that extraordinary, willful look. Medway was a gathering place for everybody. Gertie put everybody on a first-name basis, so you realized weeks later the man you'd been asked to call Poo-Poo or Boo-Boo was the Duke of Wellington. And it was there I sat next to Nancy Lancaster on her last visit to South Carolina, Lady Dunraven, talking about the great houses of Ireland before the war, and one memorable night when Sam, the faithful butler, brought the telephone to the table, and it was President Reagan calling to wish Gertie a happy birthday. That is not normal, but it became my normal. And this wonderful Tony Frizzell photograph, I think, captures the importance of these rural places, many of them saved by Northern money, as Charleston began to be put on the preservation map. The unpretentiousness of Medway's interior is a perfect backdrop. Other great properties included the William Seabrook House, restored by the Dodge family in the late 1920s, early 1930s. William Seabrook, one of the great Sea Island cotton planters, built this house about 1810, and it's thought that it was a work by James Hoban, the Irish architect, or Irish-born Kilkenny architect, of course responsible for the White House and for here, Charleston County building, which you can see today. It was an extraordinary exercise in colonial revival. I'm almost certain Nancy McClellan was responsible for these interiors, the dizzying wallpaper and carpet juxtapositions. And here in season, when they were here to shoot, they too gave extraordinary dinner parties. I got to be the tour guide of many visitors, and if I count them up, they include Princess Caroline, they include Bill Blass. I took Barbra Streisand around the first time. I assigned her to someone else the second time, but I'll talk about that over cocktails. And Desmond Fitzgerald, the Knight of Glen, who was fascinated, of course, by the Irish connection and by the bifurcated staircase that related to his house at Glen Castle. Now, Desmond, while he could be quite proper, could be quite improper, and leaving the house one night after a lot of booze, he insisted I take him to, well, a club in Charleston I had never been to before called the Joker's Lounge, which was frequented by truck drivers, and without being explicit, the major entertainment involved people removing their clothes, and I was quick to suggest that two effete gents in black tie might not be entirely welcome. I think it was a premonition I ended up here. Graduating from St. Andrew's School, my favorite master gave me this book, Southern Interiors, that captured Charleston at a moment in time. It's still among my greatest treasures, and here you see the Colonel John Stewart House as it was occupied by the architect John Meade Howells, who had retired here. In fact, Charleston seems always to have been with me and followed me. Shortly after arriving in New York, and with the help of my friend Angela Mack, who's in the audience, we sold the extraordinary 9 pastels by Henrietta Johnston, America's first female artist and first pastellist. These have been bought at the Belvedere sale in Ireland by Jim Williams of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil fame, and the Gibbs was making a noble bid for them, and I helped there. There were private people interested, and I was talking about them one day, and a very nice gentleman asked me a few questions after, and he turned out to be the high bidder, and they now live at Charleville House in Ireland, so they have come back to where they were created in the very early 18th century by this extraordinary artist, Henrietta de Bewley Deering Johnston. And I think one of the most touching moments of my Winterthur career as I neared the end of my career and they neared the end of their lives, was to have John and Judy Herdig give this incredible pastel by Henrietta Johnston to Winterthur in my honor. So there you have it. Much is lost. Of course, at Winterthur we had this extraordinary interior from Mansion House, as it was known, later the Jones Hotel, operated by free people of color who also enslaved people on this property. It was the most famous hotel in Charleston in the 1820s and 30s, and we know a great deal about the cuisine. This room was acquired by Yale University Art Gallery, where it remained unreconstructed and was eventually cajoled out of Yale by Henry Francis DuPont, who installed it at Winterthur in the 1950s. Very sadly, it no longer functions as one of the display rooms, and rather as a function room, that ghastly, ghastly word I hate. Well, I'm going to reminisce a little bit about areas of particular interest. I've always been a Europeanist looking at Americana. A lot of that has to do with having attended the Addingham Summer School as a wee tyke in 1980, the year before I arrived here in Charleston. And of course, this was the perfect place to have a Europeanist viewpoint because of the numbers who went abroad. Chief among them in the 18th century, Peter Manigault, in this now lost portrait by Allan Ramsay. He studied at the Inner Temple. He was called to the English bar. He writes that he wants Mr. Theus to have a look at the portrait for his opinion. He also refers to another artist that he looked at but said his painting looked more like plastering than painting. And so he reached for the stars. This is pretty snooty stuff, Allan Ramsay painting an American. After he returns to Charleston, he writes to his factor, Benjamin Steed, a former Carolinian, saying, "Have at last built myself a good house after having lived 16 years in a very bad one. I stand in need of some furniture and plate, of which I enclose you a list." He goes on to say, "Please insure it, war or not." He says, "I think I have enough money in your hands to pay for it. If not, I suppose the next crop of indigo will pay for it." So showing this mercantile exchange of the 18th century, this is Peter Manigault's new house with the cupola on the top, sadly no longer with us. He dies shortly after that order, and you can actually trace so many of these British-made objects right down to some of the textiles. One chamber has Jones toile, so we even know the pattern of one of the textiles. The Britishness of Charleston always intrigued me, and that is, of course, there were more boys from South Carolina at Oxford, at Cambridge, at counting houses, at the Inns of Court, than from all the other colonies combined. There was an extensive cousinage, there was a back and forth, and this undoubtedly shaped the taste, and we'll take a look at some furniture as reflected in that. Two post-revolutionary masterpieces. On the left, we have Mary Rutledge Smith, and this is a picture that was painted by George Romney, again reaching for the stars in 1786 while she was living abroad for the education of several of her children. The family who inherited the portrait and through which it descended fell on hard times in the 1880s. The picture was sold. It went to Lord Swinton's collection at Masham in Yorkshire and was bought back for Historic Charleston Foundation. And then on the right, this is one of Angela Back's great triumphs in acquiring this extraordinary portrait of John Moultrie III and his family, painted in 1792 by the artist Rigaud. And I remember seeing this for the first time. One of my Addingham classmates worked at Colonial, and when this came up for sale, he invited me to see it, and I would learn later at Sotheby's the drama of presentation of artwork, and I was seated with a glass of champagne in a very smart room, and the picture was behind a curtain that was then undrawn. You went through the drill. How could you not love this picture, the drama? And not unlike Mary Rutledge Smith, the list of donors who contributed to bring this back, many of them from the Ball family, because Catherine Gaillard Ball is the lady depicted in the picture. So in this case, it's loyalist families. John Moultrie had left with his father, famous doctor. In 1783, he inherited Aston Hall in Shropshire, and they never came back. I'm happy to have made a small contribution in a few publications. One, the Charleston Interior, that again captures a moment in time, and easily half of the houses no longer in the same hands they were when we did this. And then working again with Angela Back and a star-studded cast, including Maury McGinnis, who is now the president of Yale University, and we knew her when she was an intern. Yes, absolutely. Extraordinary person. And this was a group effort. I had the privilege of working with Angela on an essay on pictures in portraiture, and with Robert Leith on consumerism and furnishing great interiors. I was also invited by Peter and Patty Manigault to be an unpaid friend consultant to the interiors at this extraordinary house, one of the great surviving townhouses of America, completed in 1769 by Miles Bruton, using a great deal of imported British furniture. He and his wife actually go to Britain before the completion of the house. And it's here that Josiah Quincy, the Boston lawyer, writes, "The grandest hall I ever beheld, azure blue satin window curtains, rich blue paper with gilt mashie borders, excessive brand, and costly looking glasses." So we have a contemporary description of this house that physical research would bring back to life, including this suite of 8, now 9 French chairs, upholstered in azure blue. We found 2 tiny fibers, one azure blue silk, one azure blue wool, which we interpreted to be the finishing fabric. This may represent the second upholstery of the chairs, because there were circa 1,800 wallpaper backings used on some of these, but original seat cakes survived. That's a whole lecture in itself, but we'll keep going. And this was that famous room where Peter and Patty entertained Colonial Williamsburg, and where they would entertain me on my very last night in Charleston before I left for New York, dining off of Peter Manigault's, the 18th century Peter Manigault's recipe for turtle soup. And I had the privilege of publishing this. That was the room beyond the dining room where we had our turtle soup, with John Bivens in a co-authored article on the restoration of this extraordinary building, with much of its carving by London immigrant carvers. Well, I start with a case study of where we will be tonight, and that is Drayton Hall, this incredible property that has undergone some very recent research. It was always thought to have been built between 1738 and 42. 38 is actually the date that John Drayton, a third son of the family, acquires the property, but dendrochronology now shows the felling of roof timbers in 1747, and we think the family was able to move in about 1752. We know shockingly little about John Drayton, his education, his travels. There are many theories. Margaret Pritchard has written on this, his great friendship with ornithologists and natural historians of the period. We do know he had an extensive architectural library that included Colin Campbell, Isaac Ware, James Gibbs, and William Salmon. And you can see the bookishness with a plate that you'll all recognize as William Kent's designs of Inigo Jones of 1722, and those of you who've been to Houghton in Norfolk will see the same used. I was always particularly intrigued by the furniture there, and these sketches by Louis Reeve Gibbs, the great-grandson of the builder. Here, a press that no longer survives. Is it English? Is it Charleston? Its cartouche incorporates the Drayton coat of arms. These wonderful early, a pair of tables recently conserved at Colonial Williamsburg by Chris Swan that actually predate the house and probably from the 1730s, and then 4 ensuite pier tables, 4 originals. 2 were stolen from the house before it became a museum, which was a huge tragedy. They were simply abandoned in the woods and greatly deteriorated. But is this a special order? Obviously, the Palladian and Kentian vocabulary can be seen here, and the grotto ornament really intrigues me. Might Drayton have specified grotto decoration for a house that served as a riverside villa? Drayton was also one of the very last of the great plantation houses. In 1758, a house directly across the river was advertised and said it had magnificent views of Mr. Drayton's gardens and new palace. So again, a suggestion that it was among the last as fortunes began to invest increasingly in townhouses where one could enjoy the pleasures of the city. This is a chair from several surviving objects with the Drayton Hall history that over the years have been called Philadelphia, Charleston, English, Irish, Portuguese, 19th century revival. And I think this shows some of the problems I encountered as an early curator, the mythology, the confusion, the lack of understanding, the sorting out that really needed to be done. Here, one of the chairs offered in the trade in the 1960s, an ad suggesting that it is of Charleston manufacture, which it most certainly is not. And I was able, through scouring, to find this ad of M. Harrison Sons showing identical chairs except upholstered over the rail rather than with drop seats that are undoubtedly from the same shop. These belong to a chap called Sir Alfred Jodrell, but it's impossible to know whether they were bought for his house in East Anglia. And then this extraordinary object, also conserved by Colonial Williamsburg in exchange for being able to display it. I think we'll see it tonight while we're at Drayton Hall, this extraordinary desk and bookcase, which I knew in bits and pieces in a corrugated storage building when I first encountered it. And again, a very confusing object, published by Homer Eaton Keyes in the magazine Antiques in the 1930s. Is it from the same shop as those chairs and those pier tables, or is Drayton's Factor sourcing different cabinet-making establishments? But to be certain, it is not a revival piece. It's as 18th century as they come, and of course its lineage comes from the sort of very grand architectonic desk and bookcases like this one, recently deaccessioned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and sold by Christie's. It was illustrated or owned by Percival Griffiths, sold it to Erwin Untermeyer, and in a great new article establishing its provenance, and it's now in John Bryan, the late John Bryan's collection in Illinois. So we'll have a look at this great object. A similar but completely different object is, of course, Mesda's great ladies' closet, as they were called in the 18th century, a specifically Scottish form. And Robert Leith and Stephen Jackson from Scotland have written the most incredible article. I urge you to read it in the Mesda Journal. You can find it online. Dean's is actually escaping a patrimony suit in Scotland. Craftsmen come for many reasons, seeking the money, but also running away from the law. And I've had many conversations with Adam Ballett about this piece because is it Charleston or is it Scottish? It's by a Scot just off the boat, making something he knows well. And many of you, of course, will know the great ladies' closet at Dumfries House in Scotland by the cabinet maker Brodie, which incidentally has identical brasses. These turn up on about 24 Charleston pieces. I've seen them in Sweden. I've seen them in Scotland. Did Dean's come over with a chest of brasses? Actually, I've now added a Philadelphia piece. There was a piece that turned up last year, Philadelphia, but quite an amazing furniture form. And again, showing this great love of things British, whether they were imported or made here. Well, I spent much of my professional life working on this piece, which I first saw as a student, age 16. I was gobsmacked by it, and it really consumed me because this is another piece very difficult for people to understand. It was published in the magazine Antiques. It was actually published in Milby Burton's great book on Charleston furniture in the frontispiece, and called Charleston, but misdated to the 1790s. It's an object that was made for this house, one of the great merchant princes, and this house still survives. And it later went to the house of his daughter, who married into the Holmes family. So it was forever called the Holmes bookcase. I renamed it the Holmes Edwards bookcase for the original owner. It was published in 1901 by Esther Singleton in Furniture of Our Forefathers, where she recounted, I'm sure, the oft-told local story that its drawers were desecrated by British troops and used as horse troughs. I think that's one of those apocryphal stories that grows up after a war, but the thing Esther Singleton knew or thought was that it was a pre-revolutionary piece, which indeed it is. It would later turn up in the magazine Antiques in 1936, called English and dated 1790. So what was the problem with this piece? I think a lot of it is the elaborate inlay work, the intarsia work, the veneers, the ivory inlays of bell husks. I think in the great canon of learning American furniture, you learn, federal period, suddenly they start inlaying furniture. Well, one of the tip-offs was in plain sight. On that trip, as a 16-year-old, I bought Milby Burton's book on Charleston furniture, and right in the biographical sketch about Martin Fininger, German cabinet maker, it shows his ads that he does inlaid work in any taste. He doesn't say, I'll put a little stringing around your Pembroke table, inlaid work in any taste. The other clues that gradually revealed themselves, I was so lucky on that minuscule salary. I managed to go to Europe several times a year, and I traveled with the Furniture History Society to Germany with Helena Hayward and Jeffrey Beard. I did study programs on great German organs, and I began to see this vocabulary that made sense of this piece. I go back and think, how did I do all that? In Sweden, I was with Peter Thornton from the V&A visiting great Swedish houses, and then thank God I saved my money and I went to Russia, to St. Petersburg, and saw all the great palaces there that I'll probably never see again. Now, if you simply look at a less formal piece, I think again it connects us to Germany and these Baroque carryover features and the elaborate use of inlays. This, of course, is by Johannes Krauss, the great cabinet maker of Old Salem in the Moravian tradition, and is very definitely linked to Mr. Fininger's work. And visiting Germany, you began to see these elaborate intarsia rooms with their inlaid floors and their intertwining C and S scrolls. And so when you go back and look not only at construction features, in this case, a very continental approach to doing dust boards between the doors and these incised bell husks, and then you start looking at the German furniture. Poor Brock Job has just told me getting my article ready for the inlay conference that Williamsburg featured has involved a great drama about this book that has a dead author, a dead publisher, and everybody who's ever read it except Brock Job and me is dead. And very, very difficult to get copyright permission. And I said, what is the likelihood we're going to end up in prison together? And if we do, we are in charge of the entertainment committee, and we're going to give all those back lectures and bore the inmates madly. But I think you can see we're looking at a big, beefy piece of German furniture. If you look at the upper section, comparing it to this extraordinary object, which we think comes from the Lüneburg area, and then again, looking through this difficult book, which we are going to use to publish comparative examples and look at these elaborate schemes of German inlay. And then my nerd interests. My mother was an organist. She trained at Westminster Choir College, and so I always had a lifelong interest, particularly in historic organs. And again, I began to see the same sort of painted and inlaid decoration. So that was a great connection. And here, more of these objects. Look at the pendant drop on this piece. Look at the rounded feet. And then look at a piece in Colonial Williamsburg's collection, which we also attribute to Martin Fininger. So these carryovers, these little hints, a little bit of a German accent, which he will then abandon almost entirely as more Anglo requests come. One thing I want to mention is that this is faded into variations of honey color. These marquetry bits would have been very brightly colored and probably vulgar to our taste, with bright green leaves, bright pink flowers, but what an extraordinary object. It relates certainly to this standor, or tall case clock, and when you begin to compare the inlays of the piece with the inlays on this clock, the intertwining C&S scrolls, the engraved bell husks, this could be Martin Fininger working in Germany before he comes to Charleston. And here you see him working in a very Anglo decorative idiom with carved, rather with inlaid elements in the neoclassical taste. Other objects attributed to him include this amazing breakfast table, again, very Germanic inlays. The possibility of the James Faree House fireplace surround. This is a house at 60 Church Street. And I'm so pleased that people have taken up the mantle. As recently as a few days ago, Brock Job, trolling around on Ancestry.com, added hugely to our knowledge of Martin Fininger. And prior to that, it was Gary Albert, formerly of Mesda and now the editor of the Winterthur Portfolio, who said, I've got some exciting news. I have found his marriage record. And he was in London before he comes to Charleston, and he marries one Margaret Till at St. Martin's in the Field in London in 1767, departs for Charleston the next year. Gary also serendipitously, from a family member, found this information requested that establishes his place or his home or his birthplace as Zurich. So where does he go after Zurich? Is he staying in Zurich? There's still so many questions to answer about Mr. Fininger. And he seems to have been at the center of the German school that would include cabinet makers like Jacob Sass, and Gary has brilliantly written on the next generation who inherit. And the most obvious example that Fininger has apprentices is this object at Yale, attributed to Sass and using the same templates as that earlier desk and bookcase, only the neoclassical ornamentation and vocabulary has been changed. Well, in my last few minutes, we're going to whiz around this taste for English imports after the Revolution, because it's more prevalent here. During the Miles Bruton House restoration, we flipped over this chair and found a tiny, tiny brand, P. Cubitt, for Paul Cubitt, a cabinet maker who worked in St. Paul's Churchyard. Thank you, Biffmo, and the Dictionary of English Furniture Makers. It now becomes Paul Cubitt's only known signed object, and here in an American collection. And this incredible, 2 suites of furniture actually, made for brothers, Thomas Pinckney and his brother Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. Thomas Pinckney's suite was in a chinoiserie taste, while Charles Coatsworth Pinckney's had landscape design. And here is your quiz question. We'll see a show of hands later. Could these be as early as 1802? Because Bird, Savage, and Bird invoices Charles Coatsworth Pinckney for, quote, 24 tablet-top chairs with cane seats, japanned, puce ground, stone color ornaments, yellow trellis in the boxes, and 6 chairs with scrolled elbows and cane seats, japanned to match the others. It sounds a dead ringer to me, and I would have missed the exam question because I would have put them at 1815, but I think they're 1802, again showing its very au courant nature. So here a close-up of the tablet in the chinoiserie suite, and here on Charles Coatsworth Pinckney's, a depiction of Durham Cathedral. The Pinckney family's origins, part of them are in Auckland in County Durham. Is this decoration, again, specified and autobiographical? Maybe the family portraits are around the room and your family history is around the room, but on the painted furniture. And here, British examples, I forget if this is in Ralph Edwards or Marguerite Jourdan, but showing probably from the same source. And there are sofas associated with this suite, I think slightly later. I do date these to the 1815 period. This one remains in the family. There's another at the Manigault House, the Joseph Manigault House, owned by the Charleston Museum. And during conservation of that object, the label of Anthony Abbott, a warehouseman, upholder from Liverpool. So are they shipped from Liverpool? Is he a warehouseman? We still have a great deal to learn. And then finally, this suite of furniture, stamped by Gillows, which was also ordered by Charles Coatsworth Pinckney in 1817. Now, his daughters were disapproving of this suite. They didn't like the rosewood cane suite, and they must have said so to their schoolmaster because a surviving letter says, "True it is, it was made by Mr. Gillows, not in the capital city, but in Lancaster, where the craftsmen are far less debauched." He is the first upholder in the kingdom, so basically setting them straight and saying, your father has good taste, get with the program with these very Grecian objects, and here you see more from that suite. So I've been very Anglo-centric tonight, but it's stuff that you might not hear in other places, and I'm just going to end with a postscript about a very, very special time here in Charleston, and I didn't concentrate on the Nathaniel Russell House, but it has been a great love, and it has my blood, sweat, and tears all over it, as well as the blood, sweat, and tears of the enslaved who work there and who we know so much about through ongoing archaeology and ongoing architectural investigation, much of it with our friends Susan Buck and her late husband Ed Chappell. Myriad scholars have given of themselves to document the most incredible federal townhouse in Charleston. So you can imagine what a kick in the gut it was as rumors began to surface that my organization, Historic Charleston Foundation, was going to sell this house, probably to a private buyer. It is unthinkable. It would have destroyed so much valuable evidence of all the communities that occupied the property, not just the big house, but the back house. Mercifully, the people spoke, and lots of brave scholars came to the fore. There were many, many editorials, and it was overcome. My favorite picture of the period, I don't know who did it, but I want to hug them. Someone put mourning wreaths on the front gates or covered the Christmas wreaths with black ribbons, and good for them. I think the petitions, the decision was reversed, and life goes on as if nothing happens. No one was held accountable. Oops, we've heard you. We're not going to do this anymore. There was a great flurry of emails among all of us who were disheartened, and with quite a number of you in this room. And I think the best one comes from my friend Collier Calandruccio of Cleesmos Gallery. I told him I was going to use it. It was in a throwaway text, and I thought it was brilliant. He said, "Stewardship is not passive. It requires vigilance. The efforts of many generations can be washed away in the bat of an eye without proper eldering and torch passing." So that's all from this elder tonight. Thank you so much, and take that mission with you.